Welcome to Minos, the Arsenal of Freedom.
I'm Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS...
If you need a little something special, be it for one target...
Hello, this week I've dug up quite a few very interesting facts about the Star Trek Next Generation Series 1 episode, The Arsenal of Freedom. Now, while investigating the disappearance of the USS Drake on the planet Minos, the crew battles floating mechanical menaces. In casting the actor who plays the Peddler, Rick Berman knew that they needed a real weirdo, and as this was made pre-Steve Buscemi, they were in big trouble. Later this month, Rick Berman saw the movie Ghost. As soon as he saw the mong-faced weirdo ghost that haunts the subway, he knew that he'd found the man for the job. Vincent Schiavelli performed as the role of the Peddler with such unholy relish that he was possibly nominated for an Academy Award for this effort. Production for this episode got off to a rocky start. Not only did Rick Berman lose his keys to the studio, but they were found by a homeless family who refused to move out. While on a day trip to the beach with his family, Rick Berman dropped his keys on the sidewalk. As is Paramount Studios' policy, all keys are to have labels on them on the key fobs with the address of the building which they unlock. So when the family of homeless Peruvians found the keys, they knew exactly where to go. Once inside the studio, they lived on the food prepared by the catering. They cleaned themselves in the studio's washing facility and nestled themselves on the Starfleet beds in the actual Enterprise sets. When returning to the studio for filming a few days later, Rick had to borrow the spare keys from a dubious security lieutenant, and to his horror discovered that the entire Star Trek studio space was littered like a teenager's bedroom. Evicting the people was also a challenging effort. The Paramount security staff simply shrugged when Rick Berman ordered them to pull their guns on the squatters, so Rick himself grabbed at them, trying to drag them out of the doors, swearing at them for stinking up his Enterprise. He started off by grabbing at the family grandmother.
So the idea was, let's pick a woman
who he then easily tossed outside and then picked at the other easy targets. Once the children were evicted, the mother and father of the family simply left of their own accord. This episode is titled The Arsenal of Freedom by the show's producers, but when the initial script was handed in, it was firstly called Space Birds. As the script went through some changes before becoming the product for the screen, it also went by the names Danger Moon, Shipwreck Lord, Tale of the Crazy Space Peddler, Cinnamon Men, Gavin, and Buyers of Doom. Even though the episode is called The Arsenal of Freedom, this was also coincidentally the name that they settled on.
Remember, the early bird that hesitates gets wormed.
It is recorded, Master.
One of the initial plans for the episode was for Wesley Crusher to be blown to bits by one of the hovering space weapon drones on the planet's surface. He would be strolling along with Data when the robotic drone would appear from behind a rock and fire at him, blasting him to thousands of wet chunks. Gates McSomething's son would be reduced to soupy blood clumps, and she was not happy. Dr. Crusher herself went to Gene Roddenberry and demanded that the story be changed so that her on-screen son would actually retain his life and not be splattered about the place like a dropped jam jar full of mouldy jam clots. If you watch Maniac Cop 2 and think that the convenience store robber looks exactly the same as Captain Rice from this episode, and that it's just a coincidence, then you're wrong. It's not just a coincidence. It's actually the same actor from real life portraying two different people in two different productions. Despite being called Captain Rice, there is no actual link to the popular Asian fruit. One of the background bridge actors in this episode, Marcel Green, can be seen in the first half of the episode, but if you look so closely, you can see that he's missing from the second and final half of the episode. That's because he was unfortunately allergic to both chestnuts and steam. Not only had Jonathan Frakes brought in chestnuts for lunch, the sets had also been steam cleaned earlier that week because of a homeless infestation. The young actor was rushed to hospital because of the chestnuts and steam after collapsing on the bridge and vomiting down the back of Patrick Stewart's shoulder. Even though he didn't make it back to complete his small role in the episode, he was never invited back ever again. This is how good Star Trek had become. Triangular craftsman Leon Durkin produced his first episode here for Star Trek. When on set for the episode, he was often seen being followed around by a low crowd while bossing people about. His stern efforts to control the whole episode and its production process can be traced back to his past working as a corrections officer in New Hampshire, where he would control the inmates with a stern but fair hand. Indeed, his first production was a prison musical where he coordinated the tough inmates as they swung around their arms and sang like happy sods. Despite being set on the outside of a planet on its alien surface, this episode is actually filmed indoors using what's known as studio magic, making the finished product look like it was actually an exterior. This is achieved by the use of realistic set dressing and clever lighting techniques. It's lucky that this episode was filmed inside, as it was recorded on the same day of Hurricane Philip. Most of Los Angeles was ravaged by strong winds and downward rain, while the actors and crew at Paramount were happily working indoors, creating their magical episode. In an interview in 2003, Star Trek producer would explain how this very episode was definitely the very best episode of them all, as the way it conveys threat, character, technology, and space travel were all at their very peak here. The only fault with what he said was most of it. The Arsenal of Freedom is not the best that Star Trek has to offer, but it is a good snapshot of what Star Trek once was. You could even imagine that this episode being in the original series if you use your brain to change it around a bit. This is how good Star Trek had become. Thanks to listening to my very good facts about this episode. It's a very interesting episode, and it indeed does look old-fashioned. You couldn't really imagine this being made nowadays, but that's mostly because this is good and nowadays Star Trek is not. Thanks. Subscribe if you want, otherwise don't, and I'll catch you next time for some more interesting facts as we hurtle towards Season 2, otherwise known as the second season of Star Trek.